Ready to break up with your bullshit? I mean, all those excuses that are keeping you stuck. Because you have one life to live. And if you're not having fun yet, then that's a problem, dude. Welcome to Goals, Grit, and some woo-woo shit. The podcast where you learn about the habits of kicking ass at life. Whether you want to get ripped, get rich, or just get high on life, this is the place to be. Here's your host, best-selling author and feel-good expert, Una Duncan.
Welcome, Danielle. I am so excited to have you on the show.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so tell us how you started with this project. You were getting married.
That is correct. So about 5.5 years ago, I was preparing for my wedding, and I'm a lifelong runner. I've always enjoyed being physically active, but it was in the wedding prep that I, in a kind of very cliched way, decided to check out my first bar workout class in a sweating for the wedding sort of mentality. To be fair, yes, I had heard really good things about bar and as a compliment to running, and there was a local studio that intrigued me, but needless to say, I entered in part to get in shape, whatever that means, for my wedding. When I was in the studio, though, I am a longtime feminist journalist and health reporter, and I couldn't kind of fully remove those hats. So I noticed that I did love how the workout made me feel. It made me feel strong. It gave me this full body, really, sense of strength and power. I also noticed that many of the moves were sort of surprisingly erotic and sexual.
Surprise!
And nobody in the class, though, was really acknowledging it. It was all very straight-faced and sort of prim. And so at first I decided to look into actually whether bar classes could have a positive impact on women's sexual health.
Right.
And that led me to the story of the origins of bar and the woman who invented it in the 1950s, Lottie Burke, which was a far richer and more complicated and fascinating story than I ever could have predicted. Lottie Burke was this pioneering, strange, flawed, complicated woman ahead of her time who, sure enough, was extremely open about her sexuality and encouraging of women to embrace their sexuality in the 1950s in London, pre-sexual revolution, and used her classes as a way to help women connect with their bodies and their own desires. The workout does have some sexual health benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you quote her as saying things like lifty, lifty, fucky, fucky.
Yep. And if you can't tuck, you can't, you know the rest.
Right. Yeah.
So I became obsessed with Lottie Burke and her story. And I ended up writing about her for New York Magazine's The Cut. And it was while I was reporting and researching that piece that I discovered there was this whole, this much broader history of the invention and rise of women's fitness culture that amazingly had not been written about before.
Yeah. Well, this I thought was really interesting. In the intro to your book, you talk about how there's so much written about how empowering women's sports are, but women's fitness is really sort of ignored as kind of embarrassing fads. Why do you think that
Exactly. Yeah. For many reasons, but when I started this project and I would think about the popular coverage I'd seen of women's fitness history, I thought about the Halloween costume version, sort of shiny, fluorescent spandex and leg warmers and these flash in the pan fads that, were sort of very forgettable in a way. I saw this much more meaningful story of how women kind of evolved from the 1950s when my book begins, from being, pretty widely considered to be the weaker sex and actively discouraged from sweating and becoming strong, to fueling this, multi-billion-dollar industry today and running marathons and lifting weights and all of these sort of fitness opportunities that we take for granted had a history. So I think that in Western culture, there is unfortunately a tradition of sort of dismissing many of the things that women connect with and say they love and prioritize as being less important than men's interests, and just silly or trivial for a whole host of reasons involving patriarchal forces. But I wanted to give it its due.
Yeah. Because as you point out, this is how women have spent their time, hours and hours of the time and billions of dollars. So it is important and not worth dismissing because leg warmers might be a little silly in retrospect or whatever. And you also say, women were always brought up to believe that women are weak. And then you say, well, actually, that might have been a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yes. And I saw
in the
that
clothes and the way that children are encouraged to play when they're female versus male.
Absolutely. Yes. So in that second example, I mean, when the book began and throughout the 20th century, like boys were encouraged to get dirty and to be rugged and to be physical. And for girls, the priority was more about being graceful and feminine and pristine and clean, in the clothing and in the way that they played. Also, so many of the women that I interviewed for this book talked to me about how their own mothers were really afraid of encouraging them to move and be physical. There were all of these cultural fears about how vigorous movement could make your uterus fall out or somehow like turn you into a man. And it all came back to this idea that in that, mid 20th century period, masculinity really meant strength. It was associated with strength, and femininity with weakness and with deferring to the male figures in your life.
Yeah, you said something to the effect of like when fitness first started to be marketed, it was always marketed as a beauty tool because marketing it as strength for strength's sake would have been dead on arrival. So do you think that's still true to any degree?
Oh man, what a complicated question. I'm going to give just a little bit of the history first. Yeah.
Please.
So, in the mid 20th century, after World War II, these strict gender norms were really in place. And for all of the reasons I've mentioned, again, just sort of encouraging women to go out and develop their biceps and run 26 miles would have been seen as ludicrous. It was actually also seen as pretty ludicrous even for men to have like a daily exercise practice in the way that so many do today.
Yeah, it was associated with homosexuality, right?
Yes, certain aspects of fitness culture. Yeah, like particularly like weightlifting and spending what was considered a lot of time, sort of focused on your physical appearance and the grooming and the sort of shaping your muscles. Yes. Yeah, there's a whole history too about like strong men and women just being outsiders, being literally like part of the circus. The things that we really that are so ubiquitous and accepted today when it comes to building strength were quite unusual, not that long ago in the first half of the 20th century. So when the earliest women's fitness pioneers, who were in many ways quite visionary in recognizing the benefits of being active and developing strength and endurance, when they started kind of evangelizing about fitness for women, they were pretty savvy in that they learned to kind of package it, as, like you said, as a beauty tool, as a way to be slim, to remain attractive to your husband or find a man. All of these sort of, secondary gains, if you will, that sort of made it socially acceptable. As far as today, well, okay, we've certainly come a very long way, and I think it's important to acknowledge that progress. And even in the past 5-10 years, there's been an acceleration, I think, of that progress. I interviewed many fitness instructors who talked about how in the first, during the aughts, it was totally normal to motivate their students by telling them to,
Get bikini ready.
Yeah, lose their love handles, address problem areas, get rid of their muffin top, which is really focused on all of the, it was really sending the message that women needed to change to be lovable, and that exercise was sort of a duty, a chore, and ultimately for other people, because so many of, so much of the reason why we want to change our bodies is for other people's pleasure. Yeah. And you hear and see that language much less today, partly because of the rise of social media, which of course has had mixed, effects on fitness and body image, but it has first of all allowed people to it's been more of a two-way conversation for people to push back against that messaging. And it's also allowed a much more diverse set of fitness influencers who represent, lots of different body types, and the idea that you can be, that a fit body doesn't just look one way. It has allowed them to rise and have a voice and develop communities. So we're getting there, but we still have a long way to go.
Totally. Well, it's so funny because I wanted to ask you what you think about the ethics of the classic fitness Trojan horse, where you advertise, get toned abs, and really what you're delivering is a sense of strength and self-empowerment and feeling so good. I mean, that is the journey that most women go on. Like, you started to get ready for the wedding, and then you found that you loved the way it made you feel. And as a fitness marketer, I will tell you, hands down, what is going to get clicks is not feel good. It is look good. And so I wonder, what do you think of the ethics of marketing, look good, when really, if your intention is you want to help people feel good? Do you think the ends justify the means?
I mean, this is in some ways the $1 million question of the industry
right
now.
I'm just putting it on you right now.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, this was such a common theme. So many women, particularly in the 70s and 80s, the promise that got them through the door was looking good for their college reunion or losing weight, and in a pretty short period of time, they discovered all of these more profound benefits for physical and, mental and emotional health. However, I don't think I can endorse highlighting, the sort of promise of physical change, of a makeover, of aesthetic change, because for, at this moment in time, that is still many people's personal incentive. And it's also, it makes sense. I mean, like I said, I mean, that has been my incentive at times. It's so much more concrete than feeling good or warding off, certainly more fun than thinking about, warding off back pain or disease.
Yes.
And so it can feel deceptively fun. It's the promise of a makeover, of a whole new you. But inherent in it is this idea that it's only when you change your body and your physical appearance that you will be, lovable, whole, accepted, all of that. So, focus on the feeling good. People are going to bring their own incentives to it anyway. Right. And then, and then hopefully it's it's not about like we can form a more meaningful connection from the beginning, and any physical appearance changes that happen are just sort of are secondary to
bonus.
Yeah, to the more profound changes.
I wanted to ask you about, you said, it was thought that women's uteri, I'm not sure, would fall out if they exerted themselves. And I was telling a friend about this project, and she mentioned bicycle face. So I know you start your research in the 1950s, but apparently in the 1800s, there was a made-up medical problem called bicycle face, that if women rode bicycles, their faces would get very strained and circles under the eyes. And so it's basically a completely made up medical problem to scare women to stay put, where bicycles were seen as a kind of a tool of freedom. So I wanted to ask you, did they actually believe that a uterus would fall out, or was this a scare tactic?
I think some combination of both.
Right.
I think, I think that, and you can kind of understand, okay, pelvic organ prolapse, you do like there are some like tenuous connections to contemporary science. And I will say I tried really hard, and my fact checker tried really hard to locate the origin of that myth, and unfortunately we came up short, but it was extremely widespread. And Bonnie Pruden, the fitness pioneer who I kicked the book off with, who rose to prominence in the 50s, she had a catchphrase that was, something like, "I visited a lot of school gyms and I've never seen a uterus on the floor." It was like that, it was just that accepted. It fed these fears. That women were not made to be strong, or to be as strong as men, that it was important to maintain the social order of men being the more physically capable people in a relationship. But it was interesting to see, and the bicycle example is a great example of this. Like, as women started to gain more social power, and started to be more encouraged to move, these kind of like social checks would come into play, and fears about what being physical could do to a woman's body were just reinforced, I think, as a way, kind of as a way to hold women back.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite parts of your book was when you talk about how people stopped wearing girdles. And so DuPont, whoever made girdles, had all this dead stock, Lycra and spandex, and then it became repurposed as fitness wear. So the ultimate kind of garment of oppression became the ultimate garment of freedom. I thought that was such a great story about how that came about.
And that is one of my favorite stories in the book. Yeah,
totally. And talk about how the jog bra came about too. It never made me think about how much women's fashion. I mean, I certainly have clients who will not sweat because they don't want to mess up their hair still today. And you mentioned that was a huge issue in the 60s when you had to have the bouffant and you had to hold it for a week or whatever. And you were expected to wear dresses and whatever. Like, how could you move?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There were these sort of like dual but interconnected stories of fashion and the way that it influenced women's ability to move throughout this history. There was the streetwear, the everyday fashion of dresses and girdles, and in some ways, like the bouffant was like the girdle of the hair, that, and the shoes, the footwear that just in general constricted women. It made it really difficult. I'm repeating myself, but just, to be physical. And in some ways that's why, and I write about this, the mini skirt and the mini dress in the 60s was so revolutionary, because Mary Quant, who popularized the mini skirt, liked to say you could run for a bus, you could dance, there was an element of freedom. The other side to that, which I trace throughout, is that as as everyday fashion became more revealing, and there was less fabric encasing women, it also meant that our bodies were more exposed. And so the standards for how our bodies should look were raised. The other thread, which you mentioned, is how, it was sort of one was feeding the other, but how as women became more active throughout the 60s and 70s, it led to the creation of these new industries like, the exercise leotard and the sports bra, which wasn't invented until 1977. And I just, I always, that fact alone, that was sort of one of the first pieces of history that I stumbled on in this larger area. And it really fueled me, because I'm like, it partly spoke to how little women were moving on a mass scale for so long, but also just, necessity is the mother of invention, and how what was happening at that time fueled its creation.
And how we take it so for granted. Like you think, what do you mean there were no sports bras? What did you do when you needed to bounce around?
Yeah, well, women, if you were small breasted, many women just went braless, or if you were larger breasted, you would sometimes wear a bra that was a size too small, or wear two bras. None of the options were great.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well, I wanted to ask you another question about fashion and fitness and that interplay. So the female body that's, most desirable in different eras kind of changed. So you wrote, in the 1970s, there continued to be a lot of articles about how to slim down, but the body ideal also started to look a little bit more athletic. And so this is the same time that women started jogging and the aerobic dance craze was happening. So I'm wondering, what came first, the fitness trend or the body ideal? Or what do you think about that interplay?
Yeah. I mean, it's not completely black and white, but the sort of ratcheting up of ideals of the culturally celebrated body and beauty ideal of an era, I think in some cases, like the fitness trend came first. So in the 1950s, there was this huge focus on thinness, and there were diet pills were all the rage. Like women's magazines promoted these really extreme deprivation diets. And really, though, women were not as, it wasn't even fully accepted that exercise would like make you thin, I mean, and so, which I could go off on a whole tangent about what we know about that today, but there were many periods in our history when that has been like dogma. So in any case, what basically started to happen was, okay, women's exercise became more acceptable. It became more widely marketed as a beauty tool and a figure shaping tool. And so, and also celebrities, I should say, and actresses, really have been kind of early adopters of a lot of fitness trends throughout the past 150 years. And so, just like today, that helped to popularize them. So as becoming more active and these various, fitness movements took off, the beauty ideal, the body ideal became slightly more out of reach for many women, because it wasn't enough to like just be thin. Now it was be thin and also be, very toned. And then in the 80s, it transitioned to sort of being, completely devoid of all fat, which for a long time, a little bit of softness, had really defined femininity, and then moving into bodies of steel and yoga bodies after that, because everything is cyclical. Yes. And so it's sort of like the particular fitness movement that fueled a particular body ideal would take root. Some key like influencers of their day, would start to sport that body. And then that in turn helped to fuel the fitness movement, which then would eventually, sort of give rise to an even more rigorous
requirement for that kind of body.
exercise.
Yeah.
Correct.
Like we all saw Linda Hamilton's arms and went, whoa, I want those arms. And then we started pumping even more, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was, it was like there still had to be groundwork laid to get to Linda Hamilton.
Yeah.
But then, she was like the tipping point that, that
the average housewife started wanting.
Inspired millions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about the trend towards getting stronger. So you talk about Lisa Lyons, who was one of the first known female bodybuilders, and she started getting a lot of press, and then she ended up posing for Playboy. And I think you mentioned that Gloria Steinem, who at first was like, "Oh my gosh, Lisa Lyons, she's amazing," and then when she posed for Playboy, Gloria Steinem said something to the effect of like, "I'm not sure if this is a win because it's expanding our idea of beauty, or if it's a loss because it's showing that like every woman is sexually available." So I'm not asking you to answer that, but I do wonder, do you know what was the Playboy reader's response to Lisa Lyons' muscles?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so to be completely honest, the historian in me wants to go back. No, I mean, I care. But I want to go back to like my archives and look up the actual response. I mean, I think culturally, I can say Lisa Lyon was just such a fascinating figure. She won one of the earliest contemporary women's bodybuilding competitions in the late 1970s. And, for a short time became this superstar. And what she really did was she became like a spokesperson for the idea that you could be fit and feminine and that muscles weren't inherently ugly or masculine, and also that muscles could be sexy. And that was a big part of it. It was like, because women had been really conditioned, everyone had been really conditioned to believe that bulk and brawn were just universally unsexy, unappealing, not something that was, fit for a woman. And so she became like an actual performance artist for a little while. So she sort of, this was, and a bit of an exhibitionist. I mean, this was in her nature, but she was very smart in some ways, that she just leaned into that message. And she did have a big influence on women's interest in lifting weights and men's acceptance of women lifting weights. But as Gloria Steinem said, it's sort of, and that's why this topic is endlessly fascinating. It's like, is it a win for feminism or for the patriarchy, or somewhere in between? I mean, the first ever all women's road race, which happened in Central Park in the 70s, the director of the race had Playboy bunnies come to the start line, just to get attention. And it's like, yeah.
And wasn't it sponsored by a pantyhose thing to be like, look at all those sexy legs running?
By legs. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Because they knew they would get great shots of women's legs. Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit about some language. So I was thinking about how we describe fit bodies. We say like, oh, she's got a nice body, or she's got a good body. Like, when did this association between fitness and virtue happen? It
really took off in the 1980s. We began to see it rise kind of throughout the 70s. But it was in the 80s as baby boomers were starting to age a little bit and really wanting to hold on to their youth and their appearance. And at the same time, sort of the body was seen as this form of capital, human capital, that fitness became marketed and seen as this unassailable good. Fitness started to be talked about, and you would start talking about your workouts and your accomplishments in job interviews. It signaled that you were, dedicated and disciplined and would therefore be a good worker. The media scholar Susan J. Douglas, who I quote a lot, I quote frequently in the book, talks about how for women, like a smooth, dimpleless, like rear area and thighs were seen as an achievement, and a sign of worth. And there were so many sort of inherent issues with that connection, including the fact that so many people, the having the time and resources to exercise is a luxury unto itself, having a body that allows you to move in ways that, to pursue fitness is a privilege. And for so much of its history, fitness was marketed primarily to, middle to upper class white communities. So it really helped to reinforce so many, really racist and classist beliefs.
Yeah.
And we're still really, very much just beginning to untangle that.
For sure.
It also, it's also this idea again that a fit body has to look one way, which we now know is not true.
Yeah. And it was a status symbol. And that's when it got established.
Very
as
much.
Such. Yeah. Well, okay. And you mentioned the dimpleless bottom. That was another language thing I wanted to ask you about. This word cellulite and the marketing of cellulite. Yeah. You said, I think that was invented in the 90s. It can't be that recent.
I think the 70s is when we first started to see, it first started appearing as like an enemy that women, a problem that women
should be worried
about. To work hard to vanquish. Exactly. And then in the 90s, the 90s was an era of extreme thinness. It was both the rise of like buns of steel and in the beginning of the decade and the rock hard body. And by the end, the kind of ultra thin yoga body ideal, which was in many ways a return to the 1950s. And, thanks to women's magazines and a number of other kind of cultural forces, women continued to be toned to go to whatever length it took to
vanquish this new enemy. What about the word toned? When did that come into play? Because I understand that as a marketing term that was used to sort of say muscly, but not too muscly. It was kind of to assuage women's fears about bulking up. But did that come around the same time as buns of steel? Because buns of steel, I think you said, was the first time we got the idea of spot reducing, right?
It's when the idea of just, again, I'm trying to think of, it was this like warlike language of, busting cellulite really took off. But toned actually has roots going back much, much farther. Like I know in the 1950s, women they wanted to be toned or have tone, but not in the way that we think of today. It just meant actually a word that was really popular for much of the 20th century that we don't really use anymore is flab. We still use it some, but like flabby and flab, that was what women still feared flab. So I think there was even there was a documentary called the Flabby American. And that word also even then implied, like a lack of discipline, a lack of conviction. So anyhow, tone goes back much further. I don't know when it first sort of entered the lexicon. Its meaning changed a little bit over the decades. And it became something that you could really actively pursue beyond just restricting what you ate. Problem areas, it's again, it's this sort of slow ratcheting up where women's
Right.
magazines would offer, like, there were these very gentle kind of calisthenic like exercises, or if you've seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel,
Yes.
some of what's in those scenes, which were modeled after Helena Rubinstein salons, um, uh, some of that was going on, the like gentle calisthenics and the twisting and the bending, but you weren't supposed to break a sweat while doing it. And there was yoga as well, which of course has a very long history. But it was in I want to say the 80s and 90s, that, and it kind of coincided with the idea that, like, okay, like the girl power idea that women could do anything and be anything, including ridding your body of all fat and cellulite and achieving this perfect ideal. It was this really
And you are the
quite
master. You can
toxic
pick the
twist on it.
spot. Yeah. You can pick the
Exactly.
spot. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And it, it was this sort of distortion of the idea that women could do anything and that their bodies were in their control. It was a different way of encouraging women to, of trying to promote kind of like bodily autonomy and control.
Right. Okay. So I want to take you from flab to fat. So you end the book and you say, I'm going to use the word fat now. And you use the word fat even to describe to people. So tell us about the choice to use the word fat.
Well, particularly in that last chapter, I used the word fat because that was the term that the people I was writing about chose and choose to describe themselves.
Yep.
There's the argument in the fat acceptance and body positive community that fat only has negative connotations because we've sort of allowed it to. We've imbued it, with those connotations. There's nothing inherently good or bad about being thin or fat, larger bodied, smaller bodied. It's just our reality, and the key, the way forward is acceptance of all kinds of bodies and body neutrality in a way. You don't have to like be in love with your body every minute. It's just about acceptance. So I wanted to honor, the people I was writing about. I wanted to honor their preferences. Again, it doesn't, I think it's a really inspiring sort of way that they're reclaiming that word. At the same time, it's not a word that everybody feels comfortable with, but, particularly if you look at like multi-generationally, a lot of the older generations just can't quite get behind calling themselves that and feeling good about it. So it's about using the language that feels right to you. And if that, and hopefully we'll get to a point where there's a lot less charge behind
around that word,
some of these terms. Yeah,
for sure. I wanted to ask you something a little woo-woo. So I was thinking of like Soul Cycle and of course yoga and even the kind of runner's high. I was wondering, do you think that exercise is taking the place of, a spiritual need, fulfilling a spiritual need in sort of a society that's becoming a little bit more secular?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's also, so there's been a lot written about how when the gym first sort of rose in American culture and Canadian culture in the 1980s, it became like the third place, that people could go outside of work and home. And for many, many years, the religious communities had served that purpose. And so first of all, it is a place of community for many people, of belonging, of mutual pursuit of, sort of higher goals and purpose. And I really think there are many ways to look at it. I mean, I think it also depends on the way that it's being marketed and sold. Like I think we now know that that movement and physical activity and exercise can bring with it so many real physical and emotional benefits, and including instilling in us a greater sense of purpose and hope and connectedness and all these really wonderful things and keys to happiness that humans crave. So if you aren't drawn to religion, it's really appealing, or as a complement to your religion. But there have also been many instances in which fitness instructors and leaders can sort of ascend to this
guru status,
religious leader status, not always with their followers' best interests at heart. So I think it's always important to go into a workout with your eyes open and really look at like what's being sold and how it really makes you feel.
Yes, that's super smart. So you, in researching this project, you did a bunch of old school workouts, right? Like you did some of the records and buns of steel and stuff. So was there anything that you were like, damn, this needs a revival. This is good stuff.
100% jazzercise, which hasn't gone away. So Jazzercise in 2019 celebrated its 50th anniversary, and they are very much still going strong. It's actually amazing. And part of the reason why is because they've adapted, but the old school Jazzercise videos from the 70s and early 80s are just pure joy. And anytime I need a little lift, I pull it up on YouTube. So I would love, yes, check it out.
Nice. And it's just available on YouTube. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I also have I now have a VCR and VHS tapes, which has been a whole other journey. But yeah, Judy Shepard-Missett, who created Jazzercise in 1969 and is still helping to lead Jazzercise today along with her daughter. She was the front woman for Jazzercise videos in that era. Well, I should say in the late 70s and 80s. And she is just, she's a performer. She had been a jazz dancer and so expressive, and the music is amazing, and it's just fun and joy, and it's available on YouTube.
Awesome. So other than Jazzercise, has this project changed your relationship to exercise at all? Like, do you see it more as a privilege than a right or a duty?
I'm very aware of what a privilege it is to have the opportunities and access to exercise today, both, from the perspective of how much has changed since, say, my grandmother or even my mother were growing up in the 20th century when women were not encouraged to sweat and be strong, to the opportunities I have that many are still denied today, having a safe space to move around, having the resources to join a gym, even having the time, to carve out for caring for myself in that way. It also, the project, of course, repeatedly over many years encouraged me to really reflect on my own motivations for exercising and to think about why I was doing it. And was it for me, or was it to meet some socially prescribed sort of standard for how a woman should behave and should look? And so I'm very grateful that I feel, I'm much more able now when I embark on a new kind of movement or workout or feel tempted to really take a step back and think about how it will serve me. And it's, I guess the last thing too, I've really leaned into movement as a kind of spiritual practice as well, I would say.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing those reflections. And your book is spectacular. I want everyone to read it. Can you please tell them where they can learn more about your work and this book?
Yes. So I am on Instagram at Danielle Friedman Writes, and I share a lot of fun archival fitness, memorabilia, artifacts, videos, including those Jazzercise videos. So check it out. I'm on Twitter at @DFriedmanWrites. And my book, Let's Get Physical, How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World, is available on Amazon, through Bookshop, pretty much wherever books are sold. And it comes out in paperback on January 3rd.
Yay! Well, wishing you so much luck with your second launch. And thank you again for joining me. I loved this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.